So we are delighted to have Wendy Ju here from Cornell Tech and Kyle Wiens from the CEO of IFixIt to talk a little bit about the nature of work in the future and a little bit about how open source hardware might fit into it. So without further ado, it's all yours.
Thanks. So just to introduce the format, Kyle and I are going to be interviewing each other, and we have some helpful questions, but also I assume that Kyle is as willing as I am to actually take questions from the audience, to have a conversation about. I think maybe just to tie what we're talking about here to the theme, future of work, one of the things we might lead off with, and Kyle, I'm going to ask you, are you ready? Okay, what open hardware means for future work to you specifically?
I mean, I think that we have to move into a world where we understand the things that are around us. I think about, if you go all the way back to H.G. Wells' Time Machine, there's a difference between you have the Eloi who are happy and playing and using all this stuff, and then you have the Morlocks that are underneath the earth that actually make how everything works. And I fear that we end up with this divide where we have fewer people that know how things actually work, and that we don't understand what's going on in the technology around us. So I think it's imperative for the future of democracy that we understand the hardware that we're using all the way down to the bottom.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I guess I'll jump in for myself. I mean, I think my interest in, I have a lot of reasons why personally as a maker, I'm really excited about open source hardware, but I think from a future of work perspective, one of the things that's really interesting is that I think when we look at the way the pandemic rolled out, that was just a little flash forward through the future. A lot of the new ways that we have of doing manufacturing are going to become increasingly decentralized, and then we'll use very different materials and things like that. And so we will have supply chain disruptions and all sorts of, a lot of things that when we go into the future, we actually need a lot more flexibility in the kinds of ways that we can respond to pandemics, the way that businesses respond. And so as part of that, we have to have a lot of entrepreneurship, and intellectual property is something that basically conveys a lot of power to the existing players, and it decreases the flexibility to respond to change. And so I think for me, a lot of it, kind of the concern about open source hardware is about thinking about how as a larger society, we're able to make it so that we can respond more quickly to things without being hung up by intellectual property. And actually, I'll say Alicia and I have talked some about specifically the intellectual property around mask making and PPE during the pandemic. So there were all these people who maybe are home crafts people, or people who are doing making as a side gig for fun, a second income, who were able to kind of jump in and make masks and do all sorts of things during the pandemic because they had the capacity to do that. But there were all these things where the fact that they couldn't, they had to worry about intellectual property issues became a problem. And so I think thinking about open source and thinking about how we put information that we want everyone to be able to have and use and not have to have a moment where they stop in with the lawyers to decide whether they can use it is really important.
Wendy, I think you're totally right. The pandemic is the perfect example where we typically have all these rules and an intellectual property regime in place. And what happened in the pandemic was everyone was forget the rules. Let's do anything that we can to move as quickly as possible. And so Medtronic took one of their best-selling ventilators, and they open-sourced all the hardware designs. They posted the schematics, they posted the bill of materials, they posted the firmware, they posted everything you need, and they said, go for it. And I think that was a kind of a real light bulb moment, a light bulb moment, where we're wow, actually, all of these rules that we have put in place are actually hindering and slowing down innovation. Right. And so and certainly you see how fast things have moved in the open source hardware world. We wouldn't have drones moving nearly as fast into broader society as we do if it weren't for all the open source projects building drones and drone software all the way through.
Yeah. But I also think when you talk about just the skills that people have and what people are able to do, when we have these moments where we need people to jump in, they're really drawing on skills that they just happen to have cultivated, as hobbies or for fun or because their stuff broke and they wanted not to buy a new thing. So we should be thinking a little bit about how the education, these different skills are being built in the everyday.
Totally agree. So Wendy, I'm curious, you spent a lot of time studying makers and the DIY movement. if there's a path to, if there's a typical path to business in the open source hardware world, what do you see as the most common path?
Yeah, I think a lot of people start out as hobbyists. You know, the thing that happens is that I think actually a lot of entrepreneurs, not just in the making space, are accidental entrepreneurs. They don't come to business school. They don't learn things the formal way. They basically find that they're doing something. They get asked to make things for a few more people besides themselves, you know. They realize they should charge a little money, so, you know, and like before long, they really start to have like, they have storage issues, they have intellectual property issues, they have to think about, you know, their like accounts receivable. And like, they just like, I think they fall into it through these like back doors or side entrances, and I think that's really challenging. And so, yeah, I think if there is a typical path, it's that nobody got there through the typical path, by and large. And so I think sometimes there are people who have more formal business training that they can partner with, but a lot of times if they're working on something that's a little niche, or if the reason why they're doing something a little bit entrepreneurial is that, you know, they have to be at home, you know, with the kids or their older parents, or if there's some logistical reason why they kind of came into it that way, like those things often keep them from going the more traditional path as well. Can I ask you how you fell into iFixIt?
I was trying to fix my laptop. So I was a university undergrad, and I remember I had saved up all through high school, making minimum wage. I was making $6.50 an hour. Saved up all that money, bought a laptop for college, got to college, and 2 months in, I dropped it on the power plug and it wasn't working. And I said, well, I can't afford to hire somebody to fix it, so I'll open it up and see if I can fix it myself. That's probably a loose solder joint. And so I started opening it, and I realized very quickly it was complicated. And so I did what I think any of you would do, and I Googled for how do I take this thing apart. And I couldn't find the service manual anywhere. And so I stumbled my way through the repair anyway, and eventually got the thing to work. But then I did some research, and I said, why isn't this information online? And it turns out that Apple's lawyers had sent intellectual property, they sent copyright cease and desist letters to everyone that posted the service manual online. And I learned that it was an intentional strategy to hide this information about how to fix things from the world. And that made me angry. And so I'm a little bit different from your typical open source hardware business in that I don't make open source hardware. I open source everybody else's hardware. In the case of Apple, by the time I graduated with my undergrad degree, we had written open source repair manuals for everything that Apple was selling, actually going back a decade. So Apple was like the first consumer electronics company that had open source service information for their products. But it was because I did it for them, or they might say to them, we involuntarily open sourced all their stuff. And that has started a right to repair movement that continues to this day. So core to my identity is that if it's your thing, if we can't really fix it, we don't really own it.
Yeah. But do you find that the corporate attitude towards fixing things has shifted or migrated over the years?
We are dragging the repair world kicking and screaming into the 21st century. It is, you may have seen we have right to repair bill in the Canadian Parliament right now that is seeing heavy industry opposition. So what we've tried talking these companies. I went nicely, and we thought we invented a better mousetrap. We thought like, hey, we built a repair ecosystem. It works really well for Apple. We have millions of people a month fixing things using our stuff. We sell a repair part when it comes to the kit. And if you want to buy a part to fix your iPhone or other gizmo, we have a warehouse in Toronto. We'll sell you a repair kit. It comes with the screen and all the tools to fix it. It's a really integrated, well thought through solution. There's step-by-step repair guides that are free that walk you through. And I thought once we had all that put together and we proved that it worked in the marketplace, we'd go knock on the door of the manufacturers and say, hey, look, we built a better mousetrap. Do you want to work with us? And the answer was resounding no. They had no interest in it. So we decided instead we would pass laws and force the companies to start opening their hardware up. And that's what the world of right to repair is. Right to repair is basically rolling back these intellectual property laws around service information and firmware to say, well, actually, if you're putting this complex hardware out into the world, you need to make some minimum information out there about how to work on it and how to fix it.
Yeah.
And I think that is where, you'll see the answers to a lot of my questions. Like, we really have to shift the whole world in a more open direction. So you have kind of the voluntary open source business approach. I'm going to build a thing and I'm going to make it open. And there's lots of reasons for that. I think the entire economy should be more open. And so we're doing everything we can to kind of raise the floor across the whole economy.
I will say, I mean, as someone who like interviewed a lot of creative entrepreneurs and like also studied some of the reasons why people stop, and I think that people are basically running into intellectual property issues, and like these are creative work. Like if you make a necklace in the shape of like the state of New York, like these are not things that are actually protected using trademark or copyright, or patents. But I think a lot of people who are happy to do a thing bespoke for themselves. Have a few other people use it. Like they get really upset thinking about other people taking their ideas and succeeding. And if you put your product on Etsy or Tindy, like if it's successful, the first thing you'll get is copycats. That'll be the sign that you're succeeding. And I think that like for a lot of people, like that is the moment they stop, because they put something of themselves into the product and they feel like they've been diminished by that experience. And I think I'm not so sympathetic with the Apples of the world, but I do think like I wonder what you think is the open source repair answer to like the people who are having those kinds of issues.
Yeah, I mean, there's just a sharing and a learning. I was one year around Nairobi, and in Nairobi there's this whole culture of Jua Kali, which are the informal workshops. They're fixers and tinkerers and makers. So if you're going to go buy someone making that necklace, it's probably a Jua Kali craftsman who's making it. And there's a Jua Kali car repair shop, and I wandered in and he was working on the car. And immediately he turned to me and he was working on something, and he asked me a technical question about like how to do something better on the car. And I was like, I'm just a random guy that walked into your workshop and you're asking me for help. And it turns out that's a big part of the Jua Kali culture, is this constant learning and reinforcing. And so every time I go and I interview a repair person there, I'd say, well, where do you learn? And say, oh, the guy next door, he taught me this, and this other guy taught me that. So you get this incredible, vibrant ecosystem. And what we've found in the repair world is that there's kind of, the farther you get away from where the product is manufactured, the worse people are at fixing it. So the best fixers of smartphones in the world are in Shenzhen. They're all in China. And then the farther away you get from that, the less well that information has been distributed. And that's where I see the internet as this great equalizing technology. And so I would almost turn the question back to you, Wendy, and say, like, how have you really seen the internet change this ecosystem as you've been studying this over the years?
My studying this is a little new, but I do think like for one of the more recent phenomenons is like TikTok, and it's really interesting. Both like TikTok and Instagram, not actually set up to be storefront like business fronts, but they actually do a much better job. Like a lot of people prefer selling their stuff through Instagram. They put their wares up on Instagram. People like send them individual messages asking about their products, and then they like write back. Compared to things like Etsy, and I think the reason is that these existing marketplaces for like small makers to actually put their stuff on, they basically use the visual language of Amazon. And Amazon is a place where you buy commodity products, at like what you hope is the cheapest price. And like when someone who makes things that are bespoke and put their stuff up on Etsy, if it's successful, somebody else will make it, somebody else in another state or someplace another country. And like you're now competing, on this thing that is like a highly personal, specific thing that you make. Right. And I think that's something that we get from TikTok and Instagram is the opportunity for the maker to be put first and the things they make to be put second. And for individual makers, that's a big deal. And I think that for open source to work, in some ways we have to do a really good job thinking about the attribution and the credit and the accolades that come from sharing. I think that anything that treats what people are contributing, and like for IFixIt's case, like the instructions, like anything you do that diminishes the people that have done the work, demotivates people from sharing. And so I think we need to be thinking really explicitly about that there is an economy going on, not necessarily of money, not necessarily of like intellectual property protections, but there's still, credibility market, and we
It's
need to
fluffy.
think about how we protect that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that reputation, the credit is so essential, and that, I mean, it's really, we're giving our work away for free, but in exchange, we need credit, and it needs to be. You need to have that sort of chain of innovation all the way back, and that's where some cultures that appropriate open source, right? They'll take an open source thing and they'll iterate on it, and then they release a closed version of it without citing back to the original. That's really problematic. That's the most poisonous thing in the ecosystem. And you see this a lot where, like, Forever 21 or H&M will knock off a fashion designer. Like, the frustration oftentimes is that they didn't get credit. You see this. I see the New York Times ripping off bloggers all the time. They'll have some blogger who breaks a story, and then the New York Times reports on it, and they don't cite the blogger. So when you're in the information economy, credit is king, and I think what you're saying makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and I think that, well, I mean, the internet that can obscure or it can enhance like these things, and we need to be thinking about how that happens and whether it helps the ecosystem or not.
When we have a security bounty. So IFixIt we're a web platform, and we have security vulnerabilities, and we have security researchers that for free do volunteer work helping us make it better. And the deal is, if they find a problem, we give them credit. We give them a link. And that link and that credit of them being able to have the bragging rights and saying, hey, I found a vulnerability and I fixed it and responsibly disclosed it, and they acknowledge that's huge street credit. And I think it's that street cred that is kind of oxygen among creative communities.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, just to change topics a little bit about resource streams and like e-waste, because I think one of the interesting things the pandemic pointed out, that you're going to have these like supply chain issues, and also because we have like, international trade wars, places and ways that you use to get materials and supplies can easily be disrupted. And, I think repair is actually one of those things you can think about, like how can we get the reverse logistics schemes around the products that we have to make future products. And I wanted to ask a little bit about where IFixIt is in that space, in that kind of like reuse space, not just repair, but like reuse.
Yeah, when you just think about resiliency, I did a series of CBC radio interviews a while back, and it was really fun. It was 5-minute interviews, and every 10 minutes we'd go to a different station across Canada. And the more rural and the farther north we got, the more excited people were about fixing things. And maybe this feels inevitable, but when you're in a situation where you have to be self-reliant, where it's a long ways to go to get to a hardware store, you got to figure it out with whatever nuts and bolts you have lying around. You're not going to be able to go and buy the new thing. And what happened with the pandemic is we were cut off from a large part of our supply chain for a while. And so you have to start saying, well, what does it take to be locally self-reliant? And so for me, that means the information about how things are built needs to be distributed as widely and evenly as the products themselves are. And that's where I have a real difference of opinion. I was testifying in right to repair hearing against Apple last week, and they say, well, we know best. We have a centralized system. It works really well. And you're going to go through our ecosystem, and we're going to treat you really well. And my answer is, okay, so that works 95% of the time, but what happens when there's a pandemic? I'll give you an example. Nintendo, how many of you have a Nintendo Switch? I can see you, so I know you're not raising your hand. Nobody has a Switch? Come on. Okay. How many of you have experienced Joy-Con drift? You know what I'm talking about? Where the left joystick, particularly on the Nintendo Switch, drifts, and then your game character continues to go in a particular direction. So when the pandemic hit, everyone started playing more games at home, and Joy-Con drift was a major problem, and Nintendo's like formal repair ecosystem couldn't scale and couldn't handle it, and so people were coming up with all kinds of fixes on their own. They were, mods. We started selling repair kits, and there were, everyone has to invent a way to make society function or make the games keep flowing in this case. But you can imagine whatever it is. I've been in repair shops, again, in Kenya, where they're rewinding the motors on the water well pumps. And they don't have the information from the manufacturer. They're reverse engineering these water pumps. They're counting the windings, and then they're doing repairs on these water pumps that were never intended by the manufacturer. And if heaven forbid we have a future pandemic or a different global catastrophe that's much worse than what we experienced, you're going to turn to the people who are the local fixers, tinkerers. And so the more distributed the information and the supply chain is, the more resilient our society is. And that, I think, is a fundamental argument underpinning any kind of open system compared to a closed system, is by definition, it's going to be more resilient.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'm really interested in is companies that are doing a lot of reverse logistics, like taking returns for things. There was like this really funny Apple, we're so talking about Apple all the time, really funny Apple like Earth Day announcement a few years ago where they showed this robot they have to like kind of disassemble the things that they get in, and they kind of alluded to it but didn't outright say that a lot of their products like the HomePod or these like kind of smaller scale things are using recycled chips like from things that have been returned, that they're like that this is so still working, still powerful, and like super affordable for them, that they can actually just take stuff back, like, and get the secondary stream. And sometimes I wonder if maybe some of the desire not to have people repair things is because they have like actual secondary markets that are built off of the return logistics stream, which is cool.
They should have more. Should have more. So I call that robot, I call it Daisy the Death Bot.
Yeah.
Because Daisy takes things in and she destroys them. They're not reusing ICs. They're not using reused ICs or components in their new products. We wish that they were, because there's huge potential. Because you're going to take, it can be kilograms of CO2 in the air to make a CPU. It's a huge amount of raw material. Your cell phone, it's 250 pounds of raw material dug out of the ground to make a half-pound cell phone.
Right.
And then we're going to use it for a brief period of time. I would love to see, and I think a huge underutilized open source hardware world is taking our old phones and making new things out of them. Let's say your phone after 5 years isn't a great smartphone anymore. It's still a touch screen. It's got Wi-Fi. It's got accelerometer. What could you use it for? Could you use it as a brain for a robot? Could you use it? What if we took this and just mounted it on the wall and it was your smart thermostat? If you're going to buy a smart thermostat, why do you need to manufacture a new LCD and Wi-Fi chipset and everything else when your 5-year-old phone has it just fine?
Yeah, I'm with you there. But I think a little bit like kind of the way that you're laying out these how-to manuals. I was just like, well, how do we lay the ground to help people do that?
I think reuse of all of our products. You talk about the intellectual property. Take just the chip, the cellular chip in your phone. There's a couple dollars worth of licensing in that chip that has been paid to Qualcomm for patents and whatever else. So why in the world, the moment you shred that, you lose that IP license? Why not take that chip out and use it in your internet connected whatever it is? There's a really cool NGO that's detecting illegal logging in, I think, Indonesia, and they're using cell phones scattered throughout the forest as a mesh network, and they use the microphones on them to detect when there's illegal logging, and they phone it back in. It's a really cool, cheap sensor network.
Oh, that's a really interesting piece.
It's a great idea. Why don't we see more things like that? And I think one of the reasons is that these things are relatively closed, right? So the more open we can make them, maybe the more innovation. And I really hope that someone in this room goes and starts a business using something that someone sold before. Because that reverse logistics ecosystem is really fascinating. The challenge that Apple has, the challenge everyone has in reverse logistics, is the diversity of product stream. If you can get 1,000 or 10,000 of the same thing together, then you can run a business around that. But the reason that Daisy the Death Bot doesn't work very well is that Apple can't actually get their old phones back because they're too valuable, because people want them out in the world.
Cool. I'm going to ask you guys, I see some people like looking down, avoiding my eyes, like to like come up with some questions, prize. Bragging rights to the person that has the first one. So the question is whether we think companies are going to rebel and glue stuff and make it harder to repair.
And I heard you mention framework. I hope not. I hope that, and so we're trying every possible. We're trying both carrots and sticks to try to encourage companies to stop this glued-in practice. The worst thing that we have right now is these lithium batteries. The batteries that power all of our devices are consumables. It's like the tire on your car. And so having a battery glued into your phone is like buying a car with tires welded to the frame. And where Ford says, hey, yeah, when the tires wear out, just chuck the car and get a new one. That would be ludicrous. No one would buy that car. And yet every single one of you, not picking on you, everybody does it. Everyone bought a phone with a glued-in battery. And it's preposterous because it's a consumable. It's like the ink cartridge in your printer. Like when the ink cartridge wears out, throw the printer away and buy a new one. No one would do that. But we're buying these batteries these phones with glued-in batteries. So that has to stop. Fortunately, the European Commission just passed a law that's going to ban glued-in batteries. So you're going to see that change soon, just like they banned the lightning port on phones, which is awesome. we need to see more of that. And so the hope is that you have companies like Framework, which for those of you who are not familiar, Framework is a laptop manufacturer that has a open laptop. So you buy the laptop, and when you buy it, you say how many ports you want. Do you want USB-A port, C? Do you want a Ethernet port? What would you like? And you can kind of configure it, and the whole laptop is modular and upgradable. So when Intel releases a new processor, you just drop in the new processor, and your laptop is faster. So I think that's a much better world. I hope at a minimum we get to a point where that's like 10% of the products out there are modular and repairable like that.
I am a little bit less. I don't know. Like I remember like Google had this Project Era, and it was to be this like very modular phone. And you could like swap out parts and stuff like that, and that like died a pretty. I mean, they publicized it so much, and then it like died a huge death. And like I from a mechanical engineering background, I can tell you like every connector is a point of failure. Right. You know, like you glue it in, it's more likely to last longer, which is like the opposite of, you know. So in some ways, I'm a little bit more sympathetic to like manufacturers wanting to glue stuff in if it actually yields, you know, like a better, longer lasting product. So I think that they're not, one of the interesting things is they're not really responsible for telling us how they make their design decisions. And what was the, like, what are the trade-offs they considered and went into it, and like, are they thinking about everyone or just themselves when they're doing that?
Right.
But, you know,
I think you're totally right. There's a pendulum, right? And the answer is not on one side or the other. There's trade-offs. They said, and when they were designing Aura, they said it was like a 20% hit due to modularity and everything else for all the reasons you point out. So then the question is, well, which parts need to be upgradable? Fairphone makes a smartphone where you can upgrade the battery and the camera, and that's it.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the right level of trade-off.
Yeah. What are other thoughts? Yeah, someone's here. So the question is like, who is the customer for the customization and these like things where you're swapping stuff out or doing different things? Yeah.
Go ahead, Wendy.
I think one of the things that's interesting if we think about the future work is that a lot of the network technologies we have make it easier to service the long tail of consumer want, right? Before, when you're only having a few major manufacturers that have the economies of scale to make, you know, like product cheap enough to supply like, I don't know, like 80% of the like consumer market, well, it's one business. When you actually have a thing where lots of small businesses can come up and make many different variations of things for like maybe roughly the same cost as a big manufacturer, and you can start to like service like these kind of like tails where like maybe it's not something that a big company like Apple wants to do, but there's still like a lot of business left over in the, you know, integrated curve of the tail for other smaller businesses. And so I think in some ways, if you force certain things to be open source, you actually make that market better. You make the consumer market more efficient. I don't know. What do you think, Kyle?
Well, and you also, as all of you are probably wanting to do some kind of entrepreneurship journey in the future, like it's probably best if you don't go head to head with one of these big manufacturers that's selling a product that's designed at 95% of the population. If you can identify 1% that's very passionate about your thing, that's great. Maybe it breaks out in the future. A open source icon that we all look up to, Bunny Wong. At one point, he made an open source Geiger counter. How many people are going to buy a Geiger counter? Probably not that many, but when you need one, you need one, right? And so he's going to service the people that want one of those at home. Pick a niche market. You can always expand out from there.
Do you say pick and ditch market?
Pick a niche market.
Oh, pick a niche market. Like, what are the things that you guys are really worried about when you think about future of work? Like, what are the technologies or the work styles that you guys are concerned about? Well, how many people here are planning to get a big job from a big company? Everyone. More power to you, but I don't know if it's going to work that way. Yeah. Can I jump in? Because there was a really cool case study that we did in our most recent study. There's a person named Joey Castillo who makes this something called a sensor watch. And the sensor watch is actually just a board that you can put into a Casio watch. And then that actually, like, you can actually have all these additional like capabilities that, like, you know, your ordinary Casio watch doesn't have. So if you think about the economics of that, like, ironically, it costs very little and it's not hard to make small run electronic boards. even with very fancy new sensors. Component electronics is so efficient, and you can actually do it. But it is super expensive to just do even though it's much older technology, just to do the injection molded plastic, and material sourcing that goes into getting the watch band. But there's a huge number of additional products that you could get that are wearables that are very personal to people like that. But if you could just solve the watch band problem. And so his solution was just supply the part that's cheap and available and tell people to get a Casio watch. And then there are some instructions to put those things together. And there are some rules, it really needs to be the end user that puts it together. He couldn't buy a Casio watch and gut in and put this thing together, which is, I think, a limitation. But it's interesting that we're at this point now in manufacturing that you can get, that the hard thing to do is make the band.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great example. Kind of a similar example. So for a long time, Apple had the MagSafe plug. And so there's a company that wanted to make a battery pack that had a MagSafe plug on it, but Apple wouldn't sell them the plugs. And so they were buying Apple AC adapters, cutting the cable off and soldering the cable on and then selling that as their product. And clearly Apple didn't like that very much, but maybe there's a creative way to bootstrap your way in, or maybe you find, anytime you're going to start a hardware business, you have to find a way to bootstrap your way into it. IFixIt was a hardware business. We bootstrapped it. We never took outside capital, but it was a challenge, right? And you start small, and we didn't make our own screwdrivers at first. We were reselling other people's screwdrivers, and we had the capital to get our own injection molds and start that process. And so I think the full answer to your question would probably take hours. It's a really good question. You have to find that. I think this is a big part of the business model challenge. You have to find a way to incrementally get into it with the capital available and the constraints. And again, I think the more of a niche market that you can go into, the better. A good example maybe is in the diabetes world. There's lots and lots of people hacking and modding diabetes pumps off the shelf. Maybe there's a way to make that process easier and streamline that for them. And then over time, eventually, maybe you'd like to make your own diabetes pump, but that's going to be like $50 million in capital. So you're not going to be able to do that at the beginning. What's another way into that market?
Yeah, you can prove your way into the market by doing this bootstrapping. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Other questions? Things you'd like to talk about? Yeah, over here. I appreciate I'm talking to people who want to work for a big company and have big businesses, and in some ways I think open source hardware is perceived to be this thing that is for small, scrappy solo entrepreneurs. I actually think in the next session we'll get to talk a little bit about that's not necessarily the case. I think we need to be thinking future of work style about the way that the business is changing. It used to be you had to be a big company to have distribution networks, right? You would have to spend a lot of capital, develop those business networks. You would have to have people all over the country or world to figure out who gets what from who and then gives it to who. That is not the case anymore, right? These things are, sell through Amazon. There's many distribution networks. It used to be that you had to do a lot to custom develop manufacturing equipment, and you wouldn't even know who those people are. And now any of us can find both the suppliers, usually multiple possible suppliers, and a lot of things that you would want are just much more accessible. So I'm not saying this is the business model that you want to be in, but the amount of capital that you need to be in a business where you're making physical things is so much lower, orders of magnitude lower than it's ever been. That's to get started. To scale up, much harder. This is when you start trying to go to China and talk to people in Shenzhen. But to get started, much less, and that means it's possible to make money in ways that you couldn't before. And so one of the literal tools of the big companies to keep this from happening is the intellectual property. That's the reason why we're hearing about it so much more than we used to. And I think, you can play on either side of that market, but you need to know that it's there. That competition around the fact that there's these changing ways of doing manufacture is there. And you have to wonder if you really want to be on the side of the old entrenched business model or the new one.
And I would say, let's break out intellectual property. It's a umbrella term. We're talking about trademarks, patents, and copyrights. Three very different things with three very different protection regimes and different varying levels of openness with each. So when we're talking about the board level schematic, we're talking about the copyright on the layout of that schematic, right? Well, that doesn't necessarily protect that design if you reverse engineer it and create another one. So sometimes, when something seems radical, hey, you have Arduino publishing or Framework publishing the actual schematics that they're working with, it's actually only a very small part of the work that they did. But it can enable a huge ecosystem. In Arduino's case, I'll give you an example, because you always want to create an ecosystem, and then that community is sticky and gathered. So Arduino, if you're not familiar, Arduino is a board, and it's a computer, and then you can have other things you add on to it that are called shields. And so there's a particular layout that you do to make shields. And so they'll make the main Arduino board, and then other people make shields. And then the more products that there are around your ecosystem, the better. Framework released their laptop, and there's modules that you put in where the ports are, and they publish all the designs for those modules so they get other people. Maybe someone makes a cool a module for hooking a speaker system or a DJ system into it, or maybe someone makes a Geiger counter that plugs into your laptop, whatever it is, and then you get this ecosystem of other folks around your core product, and that becomes stickier. And so the value of what you've created is an ecosystem rather than necessarily your first product sale.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I don't know if Kyle, if you want to take a shot at that. Could you hear that question?
I could not. Would you mind repeating it?
Yeah, so the example was that in an area such as healthcare, when you buy something that has a healthcare sensor from Apple and you get a reading, like you have some faith and confidence in that number because it comes from Apple, who has, a brand you basically trust Apple, and I think it's because they have a brand to defend if they do something wrong. Like it would cost them something huge. If you get something from an open source provider, how are you supposed to interpret the readings you get? How much confidence can you have in that?
Yeah, great question. So in the let's put this in the security context. So people have this discussion a lot around, if you have someone, Apple or whoever, says, hey, we made this thing and it's very secure, can you trust them more or less than if there was something that was public where you could actually inspect the code? And what we have learned is that if you have a high risk environment where the outcome is really, really important, whether it's healthcare, whether it's security, the best possible outcome is for kind of it to be out in the public where everyone can see all of the constraints and everything that went into it all the way through. And so in the cybersecurity world, the default now is open source. No one trusts any cryptography algorithms that aren't published, and then have extensive academic research studying every aspect of it. And so I would say in general, I'm very much going to trust the open source medical device that has had a lot of outside investigation into it, much more than I would have. So I'd flip it on its head a little bit. Apple shipped a pulse oximeter in the Apple Watch that just got taken off the shelves in the U.S. and they actually had to remove the latest Apple Watches from the shelves entirely. Apple's not allowed to sell a pulse oximeter in the United States anymore because of patent violations, but also how good was it? I don't know. I would be more interested in trusting something where all of the specifications were posted. And I think that's an area where that may not be the most intuitive outcome because we want to trust big brands. But I'm in an environment where I have these large manufacturers lying on a regular basis. I don't trust them farther than I can throw them. I would much rather trust something where you can mathematically examine it all the way through and see whether it's true or not.
Yes, there's a question over here. Yeah, so the question was, in an open source environment where lots of people are contributing things, if you're not an engineer and you see some design, like how do you assess the quality of that design? And I think that's a great question. I think one of the things that is really important is that there's a larger community around open source. There's not just the creator and then the person that receives the creation. But there is a really strong and important role the community plays in trying things out and assessing things. And so a lot of the things that happen in open source, like the first person that actually takes a design and uses a design that they didn't make, that person plays a really important functional role, I think in writing they call this beta, right? It's beta testing. But I think that there could be a lot more actually done in the open source hardware community to create larger motivations and structures for doing this vetting so that people who are coming in from the outside can actually take things up with more or less confidence. But I think these things are possible. I just don't think they're as established as they could be. Carl, you might know more.
I totally agree, Wendy. I think it's you rely on the community. I mean, in the case of cryptography, I'm not a cryptologist. I'm not a cryptographer, but I know who the good ones are, and I know I'm not going to trust a messaging platform that hasn't been inspected by them. Signal is a open source messaging technology that has been inspected and rigorously investigated, and so I use it for my secure messaging, and so I don't have to have done the work myself. I just rely on people who are the experts, and I think we need experts to weigh in other cases. This is kind of like the Wikipedia argument, right? Like back in the day, it was, can we trust Wikipedia? It's this whole novel concept. Now I think we're much more nuanced with the discussion, and we're going to trust it when we have a signal that it's trustworthy, and maybe a more fringe Wikipedia article we won't trust as much, and that's perfectly fine.
Hey, there's a question here. So, Kyle, the question was, what are the top 3 unique challenges for commercializing open source hardware? And that's not something I'm going to talk about. I don't actually know anything about that. And you should definitely ask that to the next panel. But Kyle, do you want to take a shot at that?
Sure, yeah, I agree. The guys on the next panel will be better at answering that than we will. I mean, you're going to get copycats no matter what it is. And so, the one obvious thought is, well, you publish your thing, and then you make Arduino, you put it out there, then there's going to be an Arduino knockoff. But let me tell you, we make tools, and we don't publish the designs of our tools. I guess they're closed source tools, just screwdrivers and that kind of thing. We get knocked off very, very quickly. Doesn't matter how many trademarks, patents, whatever I file, we're going to get knocked off. We had a product. It was interesting. It's a pizza wheel for cutting. There's a sheet of glass and then glue and then aluminum, and it's like a pizza cutter, very, very thin. I'm talking like 1/10 of a millimeter thick blade to cut it. And we published a picture of our new tool, which we were excited about. We just published a picture from the profile, so you couldn't see how thick it was. And we got the next week, there was a product, competitor to it listed in China, and so we bought one and we got it. And the thing was 10 millimeters thick.
Is it a literal pizza wheel? We just rebranded it as a tool?
It was like a wedge thing. It was it totally wouldn't solve the problem. But so that's the photocopy machine that's out there. It absolutely is the case. So you're going to have to deal with that no matter what your business is. I had a famous YouTuber message me the other day. He said, "How would you feel if $1 billion company knocked off your business?" I was like, "You mean this week or last week?" It happens all the time. The company Milwaukee, they make power tools. Their parent company has a knockoff, direct knockoff in violation of all of our intellectual property that's for sale in Walmart right now. We're trying to stop them, and maybe we will. But that's just the nature of business. So I'd say you're going to get copied one way or another. Why not lean into it and get an ecosystem out of it rather than just kind of fighting it on your own? So that's answer one. Answer two, I would say, and another challenge is when you are working with open community, there's a lot of there's a lot that goes into that. You're investing in the community, and it's a different kind of business. There's community management that goes into this. You have to do a good job managing that well. You're engaging with the community. You got to be open with them. Wendy was talking about at the beginning with the credit-based economy, where you have to be willing to give credit to those that came before, is really important. There was a 3D printer company. This is back in the dark ages now. But there was a 3D printer company called MakerBot, and they started out open source, and then they went closed source, and they really pissed off a lot of people, and they alienated a lot of their audience as a result. And probably not very many of you have heard about MakerBot now. There's other 3D printer companies, and that's, I think, because of ways that it wasn't because they were open source. It was because they sabotaged that open source ecosystem. If they'd stayed open, they'd be in a much better position today. But ask your question again in half an hour.
I'm going to just jump in with slightly self-interested question. I mean, I think for me, YouTube is such an interesting transformative technology because there's so much media out there, and these things are so small and discrete. And for someone who's in formal education, and for you as consumers of formal education, I'm always really interested in thinking about how this role of informal education complements or competes with it. And in IFixIt land, Kyle, do you find that people are watching a lot more of the videos or looking at the write-ups? They're teaching themselves stuff as they go, and they're making decisions about what they want at the moment they need it. How do you think about how the media landscape helps that or hinders it?
Yeah. So another way to think about it is advanced learning, which all of you are doing now. You're going and getting a degree versus just-in-time learning. Do I need to know how to replace the valve in the toilet, or do all of you need to know that now? or do you need to know it next week when your toilet starts leaking? Right? Like there's maybe no point in you learning it now. Just learn it when you need to know it, and you're going to do the task, and you move on with your life. And I think all of us have gotten used to that just-in-time learning. How do I make a chocolate chip cookie? I don't know. I'll look up the recipe when I need it. And so that's a lot of, I'm trying to make repair so convenient and easy that anyone can do it. And I think that is going to be increasingly the case. Obviously, there are some disciplines that you need to know everything up front, but I'll tell you, particularly entrepreneurship is probably the area where what you learn in school, I don't care if you have an MBA or not, or how good your MBA program is, every day you're going to have to invent new problems or new solutions to problems that you never anticipated. Like entrepreneurship is kind of the art of problem solving unexpected situations. And I think that's what's fun about it. Some people don't like doing that, and that's fine. They should be, do a discipline that's a little bit more predictable. And so as you look across the learning landscape, one area where we've pushed really hard on is that it used to be that people considered different types of repair totally different. So your car mechanic is different from your bike mechanic, is different from your computer technician, is different from something else. Well, what we've learned is the car mechanics, they actually call themselves technicians now. They have to be computer technicians. They spend more time doing electrical diagnosis than anything else. And so we brought the whole world of repair together. We said, no, repair is the discipline. That's what we're learning. It doesn't matter if you're fixing plumbing or a car or a computer. Fundamentally, the underlying principles of troubleshooting and analysis and the types of documentation that we're leveraging are fundamentally the same across disciplines. And when we talk about right to repair, we don't talk about right to repair for cars or right to repair for cell phones. We're talking about the right to repair across the board. We're talking about repair rules in general. And so that has, I think, maybe been the new approach to the repair world that iFixIt has brought in. iFixIt is not a computer repair manual. We're a repair manual for everything. You can learn how to fix a skateboard on iFixIt, or a typewriter, or a calculator, or a Casio watch.
Yeah.
And we'll happily help you.
Yeah, if I can leave some parting words, I think, the main thing that we know about the future is it's not going to be the same. And, in some ways, open source hardware can be a way that people can be a lot more flexible and like change in response to all the different things that are changing. But also, I will just, if you think about iFixIt, it's in some ways very much an educational, endeavor, and thinking about like how you can like leave the information around so people can do just-in-time learning and adaptation is also as important as anything else. All right. And with
Totally
that,
agree. And this is like, you have to be a lifetime learner. You have to, you can never stop. You can never stop learning. You can never stop inventing. And that is what I think is so fun about the open source ecosystems, is the default is that Jua-Kali mentality of, I can always learn from the person in front of me. I can always learn from the person next to me. You don't normally get that in big company ethos. If I were to walk into some random large company, there's not someone that's going to turn to me, the new person just walked in the door, and say, well, how would you do this? But that I'm constantly learning, you end up improving much better. The product improves better. The customer is better served if you come at it from a perspective of humility. And I think that's what's been the most inspiring to me about the open source hardware movement.
all right. Thanks. Can I wrap things up? We can't pass control back to Josh.